Greetings! My name is the Schmaltzy Cynic, but you can just call me Brian. One detail I want to get out of the way at the beginning is that this video is based on my overall thoughts from what has been shown by the Stadia livestream, as well as from other people's impressions. Don't worry, I'm not going to play the entire stream here, as even I have my own limits for rambling. While I've had no direct experience with playing the game for myself, I do feel qualified to talk about a subject dear to me with well over 1,000 hours spread across several dozens of games for the last 8 years. Even to this day, I still find myself playing CRPGs, old and new, simply because they are timeless experiences that get better with age, as well as with a greater understanding of their mechanics. Anyway, to make a long ramble short, this video is conjecture from relevant experience rather than idle speculation, as I see no value in wishing things to be the way I would want them to be. So I apologize if the title card misled you, because I meant for the statement to be as earnest as possible, as well as a cheeky play on words. Now with that information out of the way, you may notice some visual discrepancies with the footage because I had to record Baldur's Gate at 30 FPS. If you played the games for yourself, then you know the game speed is tied to its frame rate. My default configuration is usually set to 42 to 45 frames per second in order to traverse the map screens more quickly. Even after setting the game to 60 frames per second, the footage wasn't as smooth as I hoped it would be, so I stuck with what works. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, then please check out my written content below, because I have written, and I will continue to write, many reviews on this genre, which includes the Baldur's Gate as well as the original Sins series. Without much further ado, let's ask an important question. What can change the nature of a brand? You might have started off this video with the wrong impression that I'm a bitter old man who doesn't like change after 20 years. In reality, I'm anything but that kind of person. You see, unlike the original Baldur's Gate fans, I have been playing these games since 2012, and the first time I had played Baldur's Gate, I abso-fucking-lutely hated it. It wasn't until I had played more modern CRPGs like Wasteland 2 and Pillars of Eternity that I ever thought of giving Baldur's Gate a second chance. And I'm glad that I did. Even then, in order to understand the terminology and the fundamentals of the game's rule set, I had to read an entire 2nd edition AD&D rulebook from the 80s, which might as well be deciphering hieroglyphics of some long-forgotten age of mankind to a newcomer in 2016. Clearly, as my own situation should demonstrate, some accessibility and change for the series was needed, as I don't think many people would be as patient as I. So I understand why Baldur's Gate 3 had to change in order to exist. However, at some point, the accumulation of those changes will result in making something completely unrelated to what you started with. So why keep the facade with the name? Marketing and nostalgia are the cynic's answers, but I don't believe the people at Larian Studios, nor Wizards of the Coast, have ill intentions. They clearly want to take the series into new territory, which is why Larian Studios was rejected the first time they pitched the idea to Wizards of the Coast. To some people, these types of honest questions may seem insignificant or rooted in a fanbase's bias for a particular way something was done. But rather than dismissing these concerns as old-fashioned thinking, we should at least consider what we have gained and lost from the changes. For starters, let's get the obvious qualifier out of the way since we're talking about D&D. There is no reason why Baldur's Gate, as a storyline, couldn't continue, because tabletop games are only limited by your imagination to tell your adventures. A 100-year interval between the first 2 games, technically 4 if you consider the expansions as separate arcs, is a perfect blank slate for the world. Although the rationale for any cameos might be stretched too thin, D&D allows people to traverse the 9 hells and back facing gods and the like, so nothing is really too implausible. It's also smart that the storyline, from what we know thus far, has nothing to do with the Ball-spawn protagonist who has completed his or her story at the end of the Throne of Ball. All of these sorts of issues are the least offensive in my eyes because people have waited decades for the next chapter. But the harsh reality is, like the soot gathering in the fireplace of an abandoned tavern, that adventure had long sang its last medley with friends from another time. Hopefully, I have explained myself clearly to show that there is nothing stopping the creators to continue the legacy based on how they approach the next game from a narrative perspective. However, and this is where the video may be the most divisive, Baldur's Gate wasn't simply great because it had a good narrative. The mechanics and the robust nature of the rule set are what make that game as memorable as it is today. Let me pose this idea in the form of a question. If you had played the game on the core rules or normal difficulty, or even on easy, do you think the story would have been as impactful if you had just turned on the story mode option? Even as an extreme example, your level of engagement is fundamental to what made Baldur's Gate great as a game, not so much the story. This example is why I could not enjoy Planescape Torment because the gameplay had been too simplified, whereas Icewind Dale further made me appreciate the interplay of those systems. Now, to be fair, this example is the weakest case against Baldur's Gate 3 because no one, including myself, wants to return to 2nd edition AD&D. THAC0, negative values for armor class, and all other class restrictions were reworked over the last 2 decades for a very good reason. They are back-asswards when you stop and actually think about them. As someone not very knowledgeable about tabletop games beyond their video game adaptations, the fact that Baldur's Gate 3 uses 5th edition rules seems like a natural progression. You won't hear me complain from that point of view if the rule set retains as much complexity as before. However, what does concern me are all the other fundamental gameplay changes that makes this game look like it has much to do with Baldur's Gate as the Dark Alliance series. For starters, let's consider the fact that Baldur's Gate and all Infinity Engine games up to this point have had real-time with pause combat systems. Yes, the Gold Box era of games such as the Pool of Radiance series, or even non-D&D games like the Bard's Tale, had pure turn-based systems, which is a better match for the rule set of D&D. You also have mods and optional modes in games like Pathfinder Kingmaker and Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire to let players play the game that way. The argument isn't D&D can't work in turn-based combat because it was created for nerds who gather around the table munching their snacks in between their dice rolls. The real dilemma is that Baldur's Gate and other similar games employed real-time with pause combat, which demands a different skill set that mixes strategy, micromanagement, and some athleticism. Even series like Eye of the Beholder or Legends of Grimrock employ a similar skill set from a first-person point of view. So the Infinity Engine isn't the only time where D&D has attempted to blend tactics with real-time gameplay. My view on these games is that they're much like RTSs with a squad-based focus instead of large armies. And one statement about StarCraft has always resonated with me. You'll have to forgive me paraphrasing here as I cannot recall nor find the original video. StarCraft is not just about your strategy, it's also about the athleticism with your strategies. The point is that you can plan out your strategies much like chess, where the solution is only a matter of reducing your chances of failure. When you include micromanaging systems like hotkeys or queuing up actions in real time, you should also consider the flow of combat in addition to your strategies. If that all comes across as word salad, Baldur's Gate is like being a football coach giving out a specific play before the match. The characters themselves are another factor that plays out in real time beyond your direct control. The only major difference between Baldur's Gate and RTSs is that you can pause time in order to think of another solution when your original plan crumbles. These sorts of important differences make the combat system way more engaging because you cannot play out the perfect solution in a fight, even on repeated playthroughs. Does this attitude mean I hate turn-based combat, or that I don't want it in my RPGs? The 500 hours in XCOM and my fondness for Earthbound-style games says otherwise. In all seriousness, the point is that the Infinity Engine games have a specific niche audience, one that is not being represented with Baldur's Gate 3, which is the series that made this style of gameplay so popular. There are many people who don't like this style of gameplay, and I can understand why it may not appeal to everyone if you're not used to it, or if you rather plan every step out. However, if someone gets into the series from the 3rd entry and wants to go back, those skills will not be translated in the same way, which I view as a greater offense that robs someone from enjoying the classics. The obvious solution then is that Larian shouldn't alienate the former audience when you could include both options, much like the upcoming Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Someone might bring up the possibility of future mods to fix this problem, And that leads me into another concern with the Divinity engine itself, the 4-player restriction. Since most people are likely familiar with the original Sin series, all I will say is that the main reason why these games are balanced for 4 characters is due to the number of people you can play on split screen for consoles. Now, the first game only allowed you to play with one other player, but on PC you can mod the game to play up to 4 characters locally. In addition, as you can see by my footage, you can also install mods to play both games with up to 6 characters, which ironically makes the sequel way more difficult, but also more fair, because you have to split up your best armor. If you're wondering why I'm certain Baldur's Gate 3 won't have 6 party members, it's because the store page says it right there. Ironically, you can play Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 online with your friends, and up to 6 characters. Now the real question you should be asking here is, why is the number 6 so damn important? If you have played many old school RPGs, then you'll likely notice that many of them also gave you up to 6 companions. Icewind Dale, Baldur's Gate, Pillars of Eternity, and the original Exile series, just to name but a few. You might assume that the number was arbitrarily chosen, or I'm complaining about a number for winning a petulant point. But the real importance behind this party size is that you can have more flexibility with your party. Let me ask you this one question. How often in modern RPGs do you find yourself bringing that one companion because you felt like the game forced you to? Maybe it's a priest because you need a dedicated healer. Maybe it's a rogue because you need someone to pick locks. Or maybe it's a warrior because you chose to play as a mage. This 4-party archetype, the rogue, the warrior, the healer, and the player, is an anathema to RPGs because it limits how you engage with the game's core mechanics. For a more modern demonstration in Pillars of Eternity, you don't need the priest if you want a druid, a chanter, or a paladin to provide healing or buffs to your party. You could also use either one as an off-tank party member, or you could combine the druid with the mage to double your magic potential. Or you could replace your tank with the paladin to get another class option. Or you can get the chanter to automatically apply buffs while forming a line of defense. If you really wanted, you could take all 4 options and specialize them into individual roles. Or you can group up 2 of the same classes so your other party members can do something else. And then you have 2 more characters to play around with to further enhance your other builds. Even on the path of the damn difficulty, if you chose not to scale the game upwards, you could easily beat the game however optimal or suboptimal your build. Or you can play the game entirely solo, if you really know your stuff, which further encourages players to experiment with your team builds. Now, I could go on in greater detail, but all I want to point out is that we've only talked about 5 classes in a game that gives you 11. Even some skills or traits can't be carried over to all classes, and the sequel allows you to multi-class with every character. However, Obsidian did drop the ball here when they limited your party size to only 5, but that's still more options than if you had only 4. Hopefully the point I am making here is obvious, but for those who still don't understand, 6 party members is an ideal group because it encourages players to freely experiment with each build, and create a more dynamic difficulty curve based on the player's knowledge of the game. Of course, there are other plausible reasons besides technical limitations why groups are limited to 4 in modern RPGs, because there is also the companion dialogue system to consider. As a side note, there's also the real-life problem of getting 4 people to play a game together. Adding 2 more people in a group not only creates more voice work required, but it can also remove the illusion when 2 or 3 characters are talking and everyone else ignores them. Larian, however, is smart enough to write their dialogue systems in a way to avoid this problem, so I don't feel this reason holds much weight when we are talking about Baldur's Gate 3. This issue is something more pronounced in BioWare titles that all focus around making the protagonist the center of attention. Now, this section was a lot to discuss, so let's make a quick recap thus far about, as far as what we know, what Baldur's Gate 3 will not be. It won't continue the Ballspawn story. It may or may not feature characters from that former adventure, or if they are implemented, they won't be as important. It won't use the same AD&D rule set. It won't have the same type of gameplay, and it won't have the same number of party members, locally or online. Once you understand where I'm coming from in this discussion, I hope I have made my case why this game shouldn't be called Baldur's Gate 3. There is very little to gain from a direct continuation. At worst, it sets false expectations for fans and/or muddies a series known for a particular style of gameplay. At least with the Dark Alliance series, whatever your opinions are of them, they were never seen as replacements for Baldur's Gate, which is why I don't mind that the newest entry is simply called Dark Alliance. However, if I ended the video right here, you might think I am not looking forward to Baldur's Gate 3, or that I don't trust Larian to do the series right. On the contrary, based on what has been demonstrated thus far, the game itself looks to be as true to D&D as much as possible. Although, and I'm certain this opinion won't be shared by many, I will always wonder what Beamdog could have made instead, since they remastered almost all the Infinity Engine games, as well as they had created Siege of Dragonspear. My hope was that they would use this experience in order to make a more original game all on their own, perhaps even a sequel to Baldur's Gate if they were up to the challenge. But it is what it is. The obvious rebuttal to this idea is that Larian is a safer option because they have proved themselves with the success of Divinity Original Sin 2, and I wholeheartedly agree they deserve this opportunity. It's somewhat ironic, now that I look back at the original Sin games, how much the engines already imitated the D&D rule set, and it's this aspect of Baldur's Gate 3 that could make it one of the best video game representations of D&D. If there is one thing Larian succeeded with Divinity Original Sin, despite the many balancing, optimization, and pacing issues, is that the engine itself was one of the most robust out there for CRPGs. Rivaling the likes of the Elder Scrolls, the DOS engine itself is equally as much of a sandbox, except with a greater focus on role-playing, storytelling, and allowing the player to create their own solutions. Sometimes these problems were as simple as finding a hidden key tucked away in a pocket or stashed underneath a pillow. Others are more complex, such as allowing objects to interact with the environmental terrain, like throwing a candle to light a puddle of oil. If the logic itself made any in-game sense, you could slap a man with a wet fish and then stun him by walking along the carpet if the tools were implemented correctly. And it's this playfulness with the world, the player, and the combat systems that is the source of their depth and their comedy. The most impressive quality here is that the engine almost handles all the interactions by itself, without the creator's input, which is something I discovered when I once dabbled with the mod tools or even the game master mode. So when I argue that the DOS engine has the potential to be the most faithful D&D adaptation out there, it's because the systems have proven that they can. Some of the more jaded die-hard fans of Baldur's Gate might have dismissed the recent footage as a cosmetic overhaul of Divinity Original Sin 2, but there were far more improvements on display. For example, the game itself has a greater sense of verticality than the likes of the original Sin games. You can climb objects that you can stack, you can leap far greater heights, and even explore the environments more vertically, such as the optional entrance to the dungeon. It's these little improvements that impressed me the most from the showcase, and it's one aspect that I hope gets even more attention as the game is developed. Now, we could only focus on the engine improvements here, but that would be a disservice to how Larian has shaped their dialogue systems from a buddy cop RPG into a tabletop experience. One thing that I don't think people give Larian enough credit for is the fact that Divinity Original Sin 2 was written mostly in a second-person point of view. We often see dialogue systems written out line by line by an omniscient third-person narrator, such as in Baldur's Gate. Or we will have all the choices and dialogue options written out from the first-person point of view. Very rarely do we ever see a popular demonstration of second-person writing in fiction, and that's simply because it focuses on describing the audience and their actions in a story, which doesn't always translate well for books, films, or TV. However, for choose-your-adventure novels and for video games, this writing style is the perfect fit for a role-playing experience. How often in modern fully voiced RPGs do you feel compelled to say something that either doesn't match with what you had thought it had said, or the response wouldn't sound like something your character would even say? Game designers have a tough enough job coming up with a fair amount of choices in these games, but they have an even greater obstacle when you also have to record those lines. This reason is why I will never desire the acceptance of a voice-acted protagonist, because it's a fool's dream to get that much effort out of an idea without wasting resources. Unless we suddenly replace all voice acting with an automated system based on artificial intelligence, players will never be satisfied with the limited number of options this development imposes on the creators. Even if we could create such a system, the reality would likely have blemishes that you cannot iron out without an actual author's touch. You also have to consider that people like me will skim through the words on screen much faster than the actors will speak, so you're not even benefiting the game from that point of view. However, as demonstrated by Divinity Original Sin 2, we can still have a narrator and a cast of characters with full vocal work. The real genius behind this style of writing is that the creators don't have to do as much work to make this system functional. Instead of writing every single dialogue response, Larian chooses to focus on actions, various tones of voice, and other implied responses that lets players invent their own dialogue in their head. The only exceptions to this rule are the origin characters, which have specific responses, but that work is also used when they are made into companion characters. As an example, if your character is given an option to lie, then you could come up with the rationale. Maybe it's because your character is manipulative. Maybe you're using deception to gain more intel on a quest. Maybe you're not trusting whatever this person has to say. Or maybe your real-life friend dared you to only answer in lies. Larian doesn't have to give you a reason behind the decision. The work is all done by the players themselves, and that effort isn't wasted on multiple playthroughs because you can play as someone completely new. When I had first heard about Larian working on Baldur's Gate 3, I was afraid the game would stick too close to BioWare's style of writing, such as in Dragon Age Origins. Thankfully, as demonstrated by the gameplay footage, Larian is sticking to what they have done previously as well as adding more cinematic flair to the dialogue. Now this change could still take away from development time because those scenes and characters have to be animated, but we can already see a healthy amount of choices within those choices reflecting different responses and tones of voice, and that was as an origin character. While the writing style is vastly different from the Baldur's Gate series, this change is one I'm certain most people would consider as an improvement once they have played the game for themselves. Even the number of racial options to choose from, and with even more to come, should give you some idea of how much effort has been put into this one aspect of the game. At this point, we could discuss the combat changes or the dice-based responses for Baldur's Gate 3, but these two improvements are the only ones I feel comfortable in discussing for now. There is more than enough here to show how Larian didn't make a simple graphical overhaul for Baldur's Gate 3. Sure, there are many reused assets from the original Sin games. However, reusing assets isn't a sign of a lack in quality when it's simply a smarter decision to conserve resources elsewhere. Yes, the early access model does disappoint me a little, but Larian has proven with their past games that they know what they are doing for the interest of the player. And yes, the Stadia exclusive features leave a bad taste in my mouth knowing I have no interest to use that platform. But from what we can gather, they are like the Twitch integration systems for Borderlands 3. As someone who will likely play Baldur's Gate 3 by myself or with a close group of friends, those features have no bearing on my desire to play the game, so I would be feigning outrage if I said it was anything more than a slight disappointment. I don't often like to repeat myself, especially if my points are made very clear, and if you made it to this part of the video, then you know where I'm coming from, but I want to make it clear for Larian Studios that I appreciate all the hard work they have done thus far. After all, I did put in the time to write these thoughts down, and I replayed all these beloved games to get footage for later. Hopefully, this level-headed explanation for a minority of fans will get the issues across to the studio so that Baldur's Gate 3 will appeal to all fans, of the past or in the future. If we can only get the old style of gameplay back as an option, then that would be more than enough to placate people like me. Modders will likely increase the party size limits in order to balance them more appropriately, but it would mean a lot if Larian gave us that option too. Anyway, that's all I have to say on the topic, so thanks for watching. If you want more of my thoughts on CRPGs, about a particular series, or about the games in general, then feel free to check out my curator page or my videos for more content. With that out of the way,
you must gather your party before venturing forth.